The autumn breeze rustled through the trees as a young girl walked up the steps of Riverside High School, her heart beating with a mix of excitement and nervousness. It was her first day as a transfer student, and the building's imposing brick facade seemed to tower over her. Her backpack was filled with new notebooks, each one representing her hopes for a fresh start at this prestigious school. As she made her way to her advanced placement English class, she couldn't help but smile, thinking about how proud her father was when she got accepted into the advanced program. What most people in the school didn't know was that her father had recently become the new superintendent of the entire school district. They had decided to keep this information private, wanting her to have a normal high school experience based on her own merits. The classroom was already buzzing with activity when she stepped inside. Students were chatting about their summer adventures and settling into their chosen seats. The teacher, Mrs. T, stood at the front of the room, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a tight bun, her eyes scanning the classroom with the confidence of someone who had taught for over 2 decades. When the new student handed over her transfer papers, something shifted in Mrs. T's expression. It was subtle, a slight tightening around the eyes, a barely noticeable purse of the lips. "Find any empty seat," she said curtly, barely glancing at the excellent grades and recommendations attached to the transfer documents. The girl chose a seat near the front, eager to participate in class discussions. She had always loved literature, and AP English was her favorite subject. As Mrs. T began taking attendance, the new student noticed how warmly the teacher greeted each student, sharing little jokes and asking about their families. But when she called the new student's name, her tone was different, cooler, more distant. During the class discussion about summer reading assignments, several students raised their hands to share their thoughts on To Kill a Mockingbird. The new student's hand shot up repeatedly, her mind brimming with insights about justice, courage, and standing up for what's right. But each time, Mrs. T's eyes seemed to skip over her, calling on other students instead. Finally, near the end of class, the girl's hand rose once more. This time, Mrs. T couldn't ignore her without it being obvious to everyone. "Yes," she said, her tone carrying a hint of impatience. The girl shared her interpretation of Scout's character development, drawing thoughtful parallels between the novel's themes and modern society. The classroom fell silent, impressed by her articulate analysis. Several students nodded in agreement, but Mrs. T merely responded with a curt, interesting perspective before quickly moving on to assign homework. As the students packed up their books, the girl couldn't help but notice how Mrs. T smiled warmly and chatted with other students while completely avoiding eye contact with her. Walking out of class, 2 friendly students caught up with her in the hallway. "That was really good, what you said about Scout," one of them said. "Yeah, Mrs. T usually loves it when students make connections like that," added the other, looking slightly confused by their teacher's reaction. The new student smiled and thanked them, but inside, her mind was already processing what had happened. She had faced subtle prejudice before, but she hadn't expected it here, not in an AP class, and certainly not from a teacher. Still, she held her head high, remembering her father's words about excellence being the best response to prejudice. What Mrs. T didn't realize was that this quiet, determined student wasn't just another face in her classroom. She was the daughter of the man who would soon be evaluating educational standards and teacher performance across the entire district. But for now, the girl decided to handle things her way, with dignity, intelligence, and an unwavering commitment to excellence. As she walked to her next class, she pulled out her phone and made a quick note about the day's events. Something told her she should start documenting these interactions, just in case. Little did Mrs. T know, her actions in the coming weeks would lead to a chain of events that would transform not just her classroom, but the entire school district's approach to educational equality. As weeks passed at Riverside High, the pattern in Mrs. T's AP English class became increasingly clear. Every morning, the new student would arrive early, perfectly prepared for class, only to face a new set of subtle challenges that made her heart sink just a little bit more each day. One particularly memorable morning, she submitted a brilliant analysis of The Great Gatsby. She had stayed up late perfecting it, carefully crafting each paragraph to showcase her understanding of the American dream's complexities. When Mrs. T handed back the graded papers, she made a point of praising several students' work out loud. But when she reached the new student's desk, she dropped the paper face down without a word. The girl turned over her essay to find a B marked in harsh red ink. Confused, she reviewed Mrs. T's comments. Writing seems unusually sophisticated for your level. Please see me about possible outside help. Her chest tightened as she realized what the teacher was implying. The student next to her glanced over and whispered, "That's weird. Your essay was way better than mine, and I got an A." During class discussions, the pattern continued. The new student would raise her hand, waiting patiently while Mrs. T called on virtually every other student in the room. When she finally got a chance to speak, Mrs. T would often cut her off mid-sentence or dismiss her interpretations with a curt, "That's one way to look at it," before moving on quickly. One day, while discussing character motivations in Their Eyes Were Watching God, the girl offered a thoughtful perspective about the protagonist's journey. Mrs. T interrupted her, saying, "Perhaps we should stick to more basic interpretations for now." Several students exchanged uncomfortable glances. A boy in the back row raised his hand and repeated almost exactly what the girl had said. Mrs. T beamed and responded, "Excellent analysis. That's exactly the kind of deep thinking we're looking for." The girl began keeping a detailed journal of these interactions on her laptop. She noted dates, times, specific comments, and the reactions of her classmates. She wasn't doing it out of spite. She simply felt that something wasn't right, and her father had always taught her the importance of documenting unfair treatment. Her classmates started noticing too. Small groups would gather at lunch, whispering about how Mrs. T seemed to have it out for the new girl. Some started keeping their own records, sensing that something wasn't right. A few even began to challenge the teacher's behavior in subtle ways, asking the new student for her opinions during group work or purposely building on her ideas during class discussions. The girl found unexpected allies in surprising places. The school librarian noticed how she spent her lunch breaks studying advanced literature and often stopped to discuss books with her. The chemistry teacher down the hall, who had her in a different class, couldn't stop praising her exceptional work ethic and analytical skills to other faculty members. But Mrs. T's behavior only grew more obvious. During a poetry analysis session, she suggested that perhaps the new student would be more comfortable in regular English. The suggestion was made with a smile, but the underlying message was clear. The girl maintained her composure, politely declining and citing her previous academic record. Inside, though, she felt a mix of hurt and determination. She didn't tell her father about any of this. As the district superintendent, he had enough on his plate, and she wanted to handle this situation on her own terms. Besides, she knew that involving him might make things even more complicated. Instead, she focused on excellence, making sure every assignment was perfect, every analysis thorough, every class contribution valuable. Other students began to rally around her in small ways. They would save her a seat in class, share their notes when Mrs. T deliberately skipped her during important discussions, and validate her contributions in group work. This supple show of solidarity helped her stay strong, even on days when the discrimination felt overwhelming. As the semester progressed, the tension in the classroom became almost tangible. Mrs. T's actions, while always carefully veiled behind a mask of professionalism, were becoming more difficult to ignore. The girl knew that eventually something would have to give, but for now, she continued to document everything, stay focused on her studies, and hold her head high. Little did Mrs. T know that her actions were creating ripples far beyond her classroom walls. The whispers had reached other teachers, students from other classes were talking, and the school's atmosphere was slowly changing. A storm was brewing, and soon everyone would learn that prejudice, no matter how subtle, has no place in education. The morning started like any other at Riverside High, but there was something different in the air. The AP English classroom was buzzing with excitement about their unit on contemporary literature. Students clutched their copies of Bullied, eager to discuss the powerful themes they'd discovered in their reading. The new student had spent the entire weekend preparing for this discussion. She'd not only read the book twice, but had also researched the historical context and literary significance of the work. Her notes were detailed, her analysis thorough, and her heart full of hope that today might be different. Mrs. T began the class by writing "Understanding Modern African American Literature" on the whiteboard. As she turned to face the class, her gaze swept across the room, deliberately skipping over the corner where the new student sat. "Today," she announced, We'll explore how these works fit into the broader context of American literature. Several students shared their thoughts, offering surface-level observations about the story. Mrs. T nodded approvingly at each comment, writing key points on the board. The new student sat patiently, her hand raised, waiting for her chance to contribute. Finally, after nearly 20 minutes, she was impossible to ignore any longer. Yes? Mrs. T's voice carried that familiar tone of barely concealed irritation. The girl began speaking, her voice clear and confident despite her racing heart. She discussed how the author used supernatural elements to explore the deep psychological impacts of historical trauma. She connected themes from the text to broader social issues, citing specific passages to support her analysis. The classroom fell silent, students listening intently to her well-reasoned interpretation. But before she could finish, Mrs. T cut her off. "That's quite enough," she said sharply. "I find it hard to believe you came up with this analysis on your own. These ideas seem suspiciously advanced for someone of your background." The silence in the room turned heavy. A few students gasped quietly. In the back row, one student slowly raised their phone, sensing the importance of documenting what was happening. The girl felt her cheeks burn, but her voice remained steady. "I did all the research myself, Mrs. T. I can show you my notes and sources." Mrs. T's laugh was short and dismissive. "Notes can be copied. Sources can be memorized. I've been teaching AP English for 20 years. And I know when something isn't original work." Tears pricked at the corners of the girl's eyes, but she blinked them back. Years of facing prejudice had taught her to stay composed, but this was different. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about every student who might face similar treatment in the future. A classmate spoke up from across the room. "But Mrs. T, we were all in the library last week when she was doing her research. She spent hours working on this." "That's enough," Mrs. T snapped. "We're not here to discuss other students' work habits. Let's move on to the next chapter." But the damage was done. The girl gathered her belongings with trembling hands and walked out of the classroom, head held high despite the tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. The sound of the door closing behind her echoed through the silent room. In the hallway, two of her classmates followed her out, one still holding their phone with the recorded incident. "We all saw what happened," one said gently. "This isn't right, and you're not alone." The girl nodded, unable to speak through her tears. She made her way to the guidance counselor's office, knowing it was finally time to speak up. As she walked, she could hear the buzz of messages being sent throughout the school. What had happened in Mrs. T's classroom wouldn't stay quiet, not this time. In the bathroom, she splashed cold water on her face and looked at herself in the mirror. She saw not just her own reflection, but the faces of every student who had ever been unfairly judged, every voice that had been silenced, every dream that had been dismissed. Taking a deep breath, she straightened her shoulders and reached for her phone. It was time to document everything, not just for herself, but for every student who might come after her. As she wrote down every detail of what had just happened, she thought about her father's position as superintendent. She had wanted to handle this on her own, but now she realized that sometimes fighting for justice meant letting the truth come to light, no matter how uncomfortable that might be. What happened next would change not just her life or Mrs. T's career, but the entire culture of Riverside High School. The breaking point had been reached, and there was no going back. The guidance counselor's office felt smaller than usual as the girl sat there, hands clasped tightly in her lap. The morning's events played over and over in her mind while the counselor, Mrs. Chen, reviewed the detailed notes on her computer screen. Outside the frosted glass window, the usual bustle of school life continued, unaware of the significant moment unfolding within these walls. "You've been documenting these incidents since the beginning of the semester?" Mrs. Chen asked, her voice gentle but professional. She scrolled through the carefully dated entries, her expression growing more concerned with each passing moment. The girl nodded, pulling out her own laptop. "I have everything here: dates, times, specific comments. Some of my classmates have been keeping records too." She paused, then added quietly, "And today, someone recorded what happened in class." Just then, a soft knock interrupted them. Two students from AP English class stood at the door, still clutching their books from the morning's disastrous lesson. "We want to help," one said firmly. What happened today wasn't okay, and it wasn't the first time. Mrs. Chen invited them in, and soon the office was filled with the quiet but determined voices of students sharing their observations. One had screenshots of group chat discussions where classmates had expressed concern about Mrs. T's behavior. Another had saved emails they'd written but been too afraid to send. "I wish I'd spoken up sooner," said one student, looking down at their hands. "At first, I thought maybe I was imagining things, but after today..." The girl felt a warmth spread through her chest, different from the burning shame she experienced earlier. This was the warmth of solidarity, of knowing she wasn't alone. Mrs. Chen listened intently, taking notes and occasionally asking clarifying questions. "You should know," Mrs. Chen said carefully, "that as a guidance counselor, I'm required to report discrimination. This will trigger a formal investigation." She looked directly at the girl. "Are you prepared for that?" The girl thought about her father, the superintendent, still unaware of what his daughter had been enduring. She thought about future students who might sit in Mrs. T's classroom. "Yes," she said firmly. "I'm ready." Word spread quickly through the school's corridors. By lunchtime, more students began coming forward. The girl's usual quiet corner of the cafeteria transformed into an impromptu support group. Students she barely knew stopped by to share their own stories or simply offer words of encouragement. The chemistry teacher, who had always seen her potential, pulled her aside after class. "I heard what happened," she said quietly. "You're one of our brightest students. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." Throughout the afternoon, her phone buzzed with messages from classmates sharing their own documented incidents and offering to speak up during the investigation. The school newspaper editor even approached her about writing an anonymous piece about classroom discrimination, though she politely declined, wanting to let the proper channels handle the situation first. In her last class of the day, she received a message from Mrs. Chen requesting another meeting. This time, the assistant principal was present, looking serious but supportive. "We've reviewed the initial reports," he explained. "We're launching a formal investigation, and we'll need statements from everyone involved." The girl felt a mix of relief and anxiety. "What happens now?" she asked. "First, we'll arrange for you to have a different English teacher immediately," the assistant principal explained. "Then we'll begin gathering official statements. The video from today's class has already been submitted as evidence." Mrs. Chen added gently, "You should also know that at some point we'll need to involve your father." She held up a hand as the girl started to protest. "Not just as your parent, but in his official capacity. These kinds of investigations require district-level oversight." Walking home that afternoon, the girl felt lighter despite the heaviness of the situation. The secret she'd been carrying all semester was finally out in the open. Her phone kept buzzing with supportive messages from classmates, including some who'd witnessed that morning's incident and were ready to stand with her. At home, she sat at her desk, looking at the copy of Bullied that had sparked today's confrontation. She realized that, like the characters in the book, sometimes facing the truth head-on was the only way forward. Taking a deep breath, she picked up her phone and texted her father. "Dad, I need to talk to you about something important happening at school." The sun was setting outside her window, casting long shadows across her room. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time in months, she felt truly hopeful. The support of her peers, the response from school administration, and her own inner strength had created a foundation for change. What had started as one student's quiet documentation had grown into something much bigger, a movement for accountability and fairness in education. The conference room at Riverside High School felt unusually tense that morning. Sunlight streamed through the blinds, creating stripes across the long table where the investigation committee had gathered. The principal sat at the head of the table, surrounded by administrative staff, while a district representative took notes on her laptop. "We have multiple documented incidents," the principal began, spreading out a thick folder of printed emails, student statements, and classroom observation reports. "The pattern here is concerning." Down the hall, Mrs. T sat in her empty classroom, grading papers as if nothing had changed. But things had changed. Her usually full first-period AP English class now had several empty seats, students who had been transferred to other sections. The whispers in the hallway grew quiet whenever she passed by. The investigation moved quickly. One by one, students were called to the office to give their statements. The girl who had started it all sat with the investigation committee, her voice steady as she shared her documented experiences. She pulled out her laptop, showing them the detailed journal she'd kept since the first day of class. "And you have witnesses for these incidents?" the district representative asked, leaning forward. "Yes," she replied, "many of my classmates saw everything. And there's the video from that last day." In another room, 2 students played the recording from their phone. The committee watched in silence as the scene unfolded. Mrs. T's dismissive tone, her implications about cheating, the shocked faces of other students. It was all there, impossible to deny. Throughout the day, more students came forward. A boy from the back row described how he'd seen Mrs. T consistently overlook certain students. Another shared screenshots of class discussions where contributions had been unfairly dismissed. The school librarian spoke about witnessing the girls' dedicated research sessions, directly contradicting Mrs. T's accusations of plagiarism. "I used to stay quiet," one student admitted during their testimony. "I thought maybe I was imagining things. But after seeing it happen day after day," they paused, gathering courage. "It wasn't right, and we all knew it." The chemistry teacher provided her own statement, presenting a stark contrast between the girl's performance in her class and Mrs. T's allegations. "She's one of our most promising students," she insisted. "Her work has always been exceptional, and more importantly, it has always been her own." In her office, Mrs. T maintained her position. "I've been teaching for 20 years, she said firmly to the investigation committee. "I know when a student's work is beyond their capabilities." But as evidence continued to mount, her confident facade began to crack. The district representative reviewed the girl's previous academic records, straight A's, glowing recommendations, academic awards. Each document contradicted Mrs. T's claims about the student's capabilities. The principal pushed a copy of the transcript across the table. "How do you explain this disconnect?" Mrs. T's response was defensive. "Advanced placement classes have certain standards," she insisted. "Not everyone is suited for this level of work." "And how do you determine who is suited for your class?" the district representative asked pointedly. The silence that followed spoke volumes. By late afternoon, the investigation committee had compiled a substantial report. The evidence was overwhelming. A pattern of discriminatory behavior, unfair grading practices, and inappropriate comments. The video from the final incident had been the tipping point, but it was the months of documented incidents that painted the full picture. The girl sat in Mrs. Chen's office, waiting for updates. Her phone buzzed with supportive messages from classmates. One text caught her eye. A photo of her AP English classroom, now half empty, with the caption, "Change is coming." Outside the principal's office, Mrs. T paced nervously. The confident demeanor she'd maintained for years had finally crumbled in the face of irrefutable evidence. Through the frosted glass, she could see the silhouettes of the investigation committee still in discussion. The sun was setting when the principal finally emerged from the conference room, looking tired but resolved. The decision had been made. But what no one in the school yet realized was that tomorrow would bring an even bigger surprise, one that would shake the very foundation of Riverside High's administration. As the girl walked home that evening, she felt a mix of emotions. The weight of the semester's experiences still sat heavy on her shoulders, but there was also a sense of relief. The truth was finally coming to light. What she didn't know was that the next day would bring the biggest revelation of all, one that would transform not just her classroom, but the entire school district. The morning of the school board meeting dawned bright and clear. The large conference room at the district office was filled to capacity, with teachers, administrators, and board members settling into their seats. Mrs. T sat near the front, her usual confident posture slightly diminished, but still maintaining an air of defiance. The girl and her father had driven to the meeting separately, he from his district office, she from school. They had carefully planned this moment, knowing its impact would ripple through the entire educational community. As she waited in a separate room, she could hear the murmur of voices through the wall. "This emergency meeting of the school board will now come to order," announced the board president, her voice cutting through the chatter. "We're here to address serious allegations of discriminatory behavior at Riverside High School." Mrs. T straightened in her chair as the principal began presenting the investigation's findings. The evidence was laid out methodically. The documented incidents, student testimonies, the damaging video, the pattern of behavior that could no longer be ignored. "I've been an educator for 2 decades, Mrs. T interrupted, standing up. "My record speaks for itself. These accusations are simply a misunderstanding of my high academic standards." The board president adjusted her glasses. "We have reviewed your teaching record along with substantial evidence of recent incidents. But before we continue, we have one more person who would like to address this situation." The side door opened and the district superintendent walked in. Mrs. T's expression remained neutral. She had seen him at district meetings before. But then, something unexpected happened. The girl, her former student, walked in behind him. "Good morning," the superintendent said, his voice calm but carrying authority. "I'm here today not just as your superintendent, but as a father." The color drained from Mrs. T's face as realization dawned. The whispers in the room grew louder, then fell into stunned silence. "The student you've been discriminating against," he continued, "the one whose intelligence you questioned, whose work you dismissed, whose presence you tried to diminish, she's my daughter." Mrs. T gripped the edge of her chair, her knuckles turning white. The other teachers in the room exchanged glances, some covering their mouths in shock. "But that's not why we're here," the superintendent continued. "We're here because no student, regardless of who their parents are, should face discrimination in our schools. My daughter chose not to reveal our connection because she wanted to be judged solely on her own merits, something you failed to do." The girl stood quietly beside her father, her presence more powerful than any words. The detailed documentation on the table, the video evidence, the student testimonies, everything carried new weight now. Mrs. T's voice trembled as she spoke. I had no idea. If I had known." "That's exactly the problem," the superintendent interrupted firmly. "It shouldn't matter who her father is. Every student deserves respect, fair treatment, and the chance to prove themselves based on their own abilities." The board members leaned forward, their expressions serious. The principal shared a knowing look with the superintendent. They had discussed this moment, knowing it would become a turning point for the entire district. "I've spent my career advocating for educational equality," the superintendent continued. "I've implemented policies, conducted training sessions, and worked to create inclusive environments in our schools. But today, I saw firsthand how much work we still have to do." The girl finally spoke, her voice clear and steady. "I kept quiet about my father's position because I wanted to succeed on my own terms. What I experienced in your classroom, Mrs. T, wasn't about my abilities, it was about your prejudices." The room fell silent. Board members exchanged significant looks. The evidence before them, combined with this revelation, painted a picture that couldn't be ignored. Mrs. T sat down heavily, the full impact of her actions finally hitting her. The carefully constructed justifications she built around her behavior crumbled in the face of this truth. The board president cleared her throat. "In light of all the evidence and this additional context, we need to discuss appropriate actions. This isn't just about one teacher or one student, it's about the standard we set for our entire district." As the meeting continued, the girl felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. Her father's hand rested supportively on her back. Around the room, she could see the impact of this moment registering on every face. The recognition that change wasn't just necessary, it was inevitable. The revelation had done more than expose one teacher's behavior. It had shone a light on the subtle ways prejudice could hide behind authority and tradition. As the board began discussing systemic changes, everyone in that room knew that Riverside High and the entire district would never be quite the same again. 3 months after the school board meeting, Riverside High School had transformed in ways both visible and subtle. The morning sun streamed through the windows of the newly established Student Unity Council Room, where students from all backgrounds gathered to discuss ways to make their school more inclusive. The girl who had sparked this change sat among her peers, no longer just the superintendent's daughter who stood up to discrimination, but a leader who had inspired a movement. Around the table, students shared ideas for their latest project, a mentoring program for incoming freshmen. "Remember how scary it was starting AP classes?" one student asked. "Imagine having someone to guide you through it, someone who believes in you from day one." The walls of the council room were covered with posters announcing new initiatives, cultural awareness workshops, anonymous reporting systems, and student-led discussion groups. Each one represented a small step toward the bigger change they all wanted to see. Down the hall, the AP English classroom had a new teacher, one who had been specially trained in inclusive education practices. The class discussions were livelier than ever, with students freely sharing their perspectives without fear of judgment. The new teacher made a point of calling on everyone equally, celebrating diverse viewpoints, and creating an environment where every voice mattered. In the teacher's lounge, a transformation was also taking place. Weekly professional development sessions focused on unconscious bias and cultural competency. Teachers who had once stayed silent about concerning behavior now felt empowered to speak up. It's not just about avoiding discrimination, the chemistry teacher explained during one session. It's about actively creating an environment where every student can thrive. Mrs. T had been placed on administrative leave and required to complete extensive sensitivity training. The district's decision wasn't about punishment, but about growth and understanding. She had written a lengthy apology letter to the class, acknowledging her biases and expressing a genuine desire to do better. The superintendent's office had become a hub of positive change. New district-wide policies were implemented, focusing on regular classroom observations, anonymous student feedback systems, and mandatory cultural competency training for all staff members. But more importantly, there was a new awareness that change had to come from within the school community itself. One morning, during a district-wide educational conference, the girl shared her story with educators from across the region. Her voice was strong as she spoke about her experience, but her message wasn't about pointing fingers, it was about creating solutions. "What happened in that classroom could have left me feeling bitter," she told the audience. "Instead, it showed me how many people are ready to stand up for what's right. It taught me that change is possible when we work together." The impact rippled beyond Riverside High. Other schools in the district began implementing their own student councils and feedback systems. Teachers reached out to share their own experiences and ask for guidance in creating more inclusive classrooms. Back at Riverside, the girls' former classmates had become advocates in their own right. They learned to recognize subtle forms of discrimination and spoke up when they saw something wrong. The student who had recorded the pivotal classroom incident now ran the school's new anonymous reporting system. "It's like we all woke up," one student commented during a council meeting. "We realized we have the power to make things better, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us." The superintendent's daughter had made her mark not because of her father's position, but because of her courage to stand up for what was right. Her detailed documentation had become a template for other schools, showing the importance of recording and reporting discriminatory behavior. In the cafeteria, the once rigid social groupings had begun to blur. Students who might never have interacted before found themselves working together on council projects, discovering shared interests and experiences. The change wasn't forced. It grew naturally from the new atmosphere of acceptance and understanding. As the school year drew to a close, the Student Unity Council organized a special assembly. Students and teachers shared stories of positive changes they'd witnessed throughout the year. The girl who had started it all sat in the audience, listening as others took up the torch she had lit. "This isn't the end of our story," she said when it was her turn to speak. "It's just the beginning. Real change takes time, but it also takes all of us working together, speaking up, and believing that things can be better." The assembly ended with the announcement of a new district-wide scholarship program for students who demonstrated leadership in promoting inclusive education. The first recipient would be chosen the following year, a lasting reminder that one person's courage could open doors for countless others. As students filed out of the assembly, their chatter filled with plans for next year's initiatives, the superintendent watched proudly. His daughter had taught not just her peers, but the entire district a powerful lesson. Change begins with one person brave enough to stand up, and it continues with everyone brave enough to stand together.